When you sit down and read ancient texts on military strategy, um, something like Sun Tzu's The Art of War, there's this feeling of, I don't know, elegant, almost mathematical perfection to it all.
Oh, absolutely. It reads like a grand game of chess.
Right. Like if you know the enemy and you know yourself, your victory will not stand in doubt. It just feels incredibly clean.
Almost entirely predictable, yeah.
Yeah, but then you look at the chaotic, completely compromised realities of the 21st century, and that elegant chessboard is just covered in mud.
Right, the pieces seem to be moving on their own.
Exactly. Half the players are playing a completely different game, and the rules, they just seem to change every time there's a new election.
Which is so true. That gap between the pristine theory of strategy and the messy, often disastrous reality of modern execution, it's
It
vast.
really is.
And honestly, it is the defining puzzle for modern military thinkers.
Which is exactly what we are unpacking in today's deep dive.
Okay.
We have curated a really phenomenal stack of material for you today. It's essentially a master class in military strategy and geopolitical failure.
It's a great stack.
Yeah, we're pulling from Sun Tzu's Ancient Wisdom, some modern framework analysis from the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security,
Also known as anchors.
right, ANCORS, plus some really eye-opening research from the Modern War Institute and the American Institute for Economic Research. And this is a big one, some incredibly candid U.S. Senate testimony from retired Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster.
What makes this collection of texts so compelling is how they all circle the exact same fundamental question, but they pull from entirely different eras and disciplines.
Yeah.
It really gets to the core of how nations actually fight.
Right, so our mission for you listening today is to really understand why powerful nations so frequently fail in modern warfare. Like, how do these brilliant military blueprints turn into prolonged, muddy disasters?
It's a heavy question.
It is. We are going to explore the traps of asymmetric conflict, the psychological gravity of mission creep, and ultimately the greatest saboteur of military strategy domestic politics.
Yeah, to understand why modern wars fall apart, we really first have to establish how war is actually supposed to be planned, at least in theory.
Right, the ideal scenario.
Exactly. And there is really no better starting point than Sun Tzu. He wrote that the art of war is governed by 5 constant factors. You've got the moral law, heaven, earth, the commander, and method and discipline.
And crucially, he also offered this very stark warning that it really echoes through every single modern document we're looking at today. He said there is no instance of a country benefiting from prolonged warfare.
Which is such a massive point. Fast forward 2.5 millennia to modern strategic planning, and you see a structural framework that essentially tries to formalize all of Sun Tzu's ancient factors.
Right.
The Australian Anchor's brief, that's authored by Prakash Gopal and Chris Raman, they break this down exceptionally well. They define the critical, often misunderstood difference between policy and strategy.
I found this distinction super helpful.
It really is. So policy is the what. It is the overarching national objective a government wants to achieve. Strategy is the how.
The mechanics of it.
Right. It's the mechanical process that links the ends you want to achieve, the ways you are going to achieve them, and the means or resources you actually have available.
So for everyone listening, think of policy as the architect's blueprint and strategy as the construction crew.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, like if the blueprint demands a 100-story skyscraper, but the policy only gives the construction crew wood and nails, the entire building collapses before it even gets off the ground.
Exactly. And the Anchor's researchers emphasize that misalignments between that blueprint and the construction crew are fatal. If political goals are disconnected from military realities, disaster just inevitably follows. And they highlight a highly relevant modern example of how tricky this alignment can be by pointing to potential contradictions within U.S. policy itself.
This part was wild to read.
Yeah, so they note that the 2022 U.S. national security strategy lists outcompeting China and constraining Russia as its absolute top priority. But later in that exact same document, it calls climate change the existential challenge of our time.
Meaning you have two massive overriding priorities actively competing for the #1 spot on the blueprint.
Precisely. And Gopal and Raman argue this creates a severe strategic contradiction. They detail the mechanics of this, pointing out that rushing a massive green energy transition fundamentally requires things like solar panels, electric vehicle batteries, rare earth minerals.
Wait, all the hardware.
Yeah, and currently global processing for those critical minerals is heavily dominated by China.
Wow.
So prioritizing that domestic environmental policy could inadvertently deepen reliance on a rival, thereby undermining the primary strategic goal of outcompeting China.
And just to be clear, we are not endorsing one policy over the other here.
No, not at all.
We are just looking at how this text illustrates the intense friction that happens when national policies collide. It shows how easily the blueprint can get scrambled in the architect's office.
Exactly.
But let's say the blueprint is clear. If strategy is simply aligning your ends, ways, and means, why do massive superpowers with virtually infinite means like the US or France historically so often lose to vastly inferior forces?
Ah, the Goliath problem.
Yes, we have to address the Goliath problem.
It is arguably the defining military question of the post-World War II era. To answer it, we turn to Andrew Mack's groundbreaking 1975 theory on asymmetric conflict.
Okay.
Mack analyzed wars like Vietnam and Algeria to figure out why the smaller guy keeps winning. He explains that for a superpower, a small war in a distant land is merely a limited war. The superpower's national survival is not on the line.
Right, they aren't fighting off an invasion of their own homeland, so the stakes are inherently lower.
Exactly. And because survival isn't threatened, the political will of the superpower naturally wanes over time. Prosecuting a distant war consumes immense resources that citizens would naturally rather see spent on domestic priorities.
Like infrastructure, education.
Right. Which flips the traditional power dynamic completely on its head.
Yeah, for the insurgents, the technically inferior force, it is a fight for their very survival. That existential threat maximizes their social cohesion.
Unifies them completely.
Yeah, it eliminates constraints on how they mobilize their people, and it maximizes their collective willingness to suffer. They can outlast the superpowers simply because they have no other choice.
And that structural reality is compounded by a deep psychological vulnerability on the part of the superpower. H.R. McMaster's Senate testimony refers to this vulnerability as strategic narcissism.
Strategic narcissism.
Yeah, it is the arrogant, deeply flawed belief that a superpower alone authors the future. It's this tendency for massive nations to define challenges exactly as they would like them to be, completely ignoring the enemy's agency.
Just assuming the enemy will play along.
Exactly, ignoring their unique ideology and their ability to adapt.
Which leads to terrible assumptions.
Awful ones. McMaster points to the aftermath of the incredibly swift 1991 Gulf War as a prime example of this. The U.S. military dismantled Saddam Hussein's conventional army in a matter of hours.
It was unprecedented.
It was. But following that victory, a dangerous overconfidence set in across the defense establishment. Planners began to believe their technological superiority, their full-spectrum dominance made war fundamentally easy, clean, and predictable.
Wait, after the 1991 Gulf War, didn't military planners realize that future enemies would adapt? Like, why did they expect adversaries to keep fighting conventional, easily winnable battles?
Well, that is the ultimate blind spot of strategic narcissism.
Wow.
When a nation assumes its technological advantage is so overwhelming, it starts to believe the enemy has no choice but to succumb to it on the superpower's terms.
Right.
But McMaster notes the reality of human agency. Enemies decided to fight asymmetrically precisely because fighting a technologically superior force conventionally was, in his words, stupid.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So adversaries moved into the shadows. They utilized terrorism, localized insurgency, and irregular warfare to completely bypass the superpower's conventional strengths.
So if a superpower's political will is naturally fading because they aren't fighting for national survival and the enemy is fighting from the shadows, how do the generals on the ground try to compensate?
Well, they try to control more of the environment to force a win.
Right. And that breeds a whole new disease, mission creep.
Mission creep is the steady, often imperceptible expansion of a military operation far beyond its initial goals. According to Haley Fuller's piece in military.com, open-ended or vaguely defined mandates are the biggest culprits.
Yeah.
The mechanics of it are fascinating. Once a military establishes a logistical foothold building airfields, setting up medical units, securing supply lines, institutional momentum takes over.
A machine just wants to keep growing.
Exactly. Pressure inevitably builds to sustain and expand the mission to justify the infrastructure rather than steal it back.
Fuller details the textbook case of this, which is Somalia in 1992. It started as a very narrow, clearly defined humanitarian mission.
Right.
The goal was literally just to protect food deliveries from being intercepted. But commanders on the ground quickly realized they couldn't securely deliver food without pacifying the warlords who were stealing it.
And there's the expansion.
Right. So the mandate expanded. Suddenly, the military was tasked with complex nation-building and disarming local militias. That logical step-by-step drift directly led to the tragic Battle of Mogadishu.
And we see this recurring pattern across multiple modern conflicts. Look at the 2014 anti-ISIS campaign.
Yep.
It was initially announced to the public as a strictly limited air campaign with no large-scale ground deployments. But by 2016, there were roughly 5,000 ground troops in Iraq, conducting raids and advising combat brigades.
Wow, from an air campaign to 5,000 troops on the ground.
Exactly. The texts also point to a very current example of how these footholds begin. The recent deployment of about 200 U.S. troops to Israel to staff a civil military coordination cell for Gaza.
Even though the Pentagon explicitly stated the mission wouldn't place personnel inside Gaza itself.
True, but military analysts warn that building this exact kind of logistical infrastructure, the coordination cells, the communication hubs, is precisely the type of foothold that historically invites expansion if regional conditions deteriorate.
You creep into a larger mission, the financial and human costs start mounting, and then you hit the next psychological wall, the sunk cost fallacy.
Yes, this is a huge one.
Abigail R. Hall Blanco's article from the American Institute for Economic Research tackles this head-on. She writes about the 7,000 U.S. troops who died in the global war on terror.
Right.
And how politicians constantly use those specific deaths as justification to stay deployed, asking the public, do you want their deaths to mean nothing?
It is an incredibly powerful, deeply human, emotional argument. But economically and strategically, it is a devastating fallacy.
Yeah.
Economics teaches us that a sunk cost is an unrecoverable past outlay. Because you cannot get those resources back, they should mathematically never factor into your decision-making for future actions.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because it's like walking to a store a mile away, realizing halfway there, you forgot your wallet, but you keep going just because you already walked a half mile.
That's a perfect analogy.
It makes no logical sense to continue when the goal is already unachievable. Except here, the cost isn't footsteps, it's human lives.
Which is exactly why the sunk cost fallacy is so agonizing for political leaders and the public to overcome. To walk away without a definitive victory feels like a profound betrayal of the families who lost loved ones.
Right. It feels wrong on an emotional level.
Exactly. But as Blanca points out in her research, throwing good money, or more tragically, more lives after bad, does not retroactively validate the initial losses. It merely compounds the tragedy by adding new victors to an already failing strategy.
So if military planners and economists understand the mechanics of mission creep and the sunk cost fallacy so well, why can't they just logically course correct? Why is it so incredibly hard to stop the train once it's moving?
Because ultimately, military strategy is entirely subservient to domestic politics. And in a democracy, that means the strategy is chained to the election cycle.
And this is where the material gets genuinely dark.
Yes, it does.
Andrew Payne's research for the Modern War Institute lays out exactly how the political calendar dictates the reality of war. It is a sobering read.
Very sobering.
He shows that leaders habitually, almost predictably, take electoral considerations into account when making life and death strategic decisions on the battlefield.
What's fascinating here is how this modern political reality connects directly back to Sun Tzu's ancient text.
Oh, yeah.
Sun Tzu explicitly warned that a ruler can bring ruin to his army by, quote, attempting to govern an army in the same way he administers a kingdom. He wrote that victory comes to the general, who is not interfered with by the sovereign. Yet Payne's historical research shows that interference from the sovereign isn't just common, it is the fundamental norm.
The specific declassified examples Payne provides are shocking when you really let them sink in. He details how in August 1972, President Nixon explicitly told Henry Kissinger to find a decent interval in Vietnam.
A decent interval.
Right. Nixon and Kissinger knew the South Vietnamese government was highly unlikely to survive, but Nixon just needed to prevent a visible collapse before his re-election campaign in November.
Just pushing the timeline for optics.
Exactly. They deliberately prolonged a failing war, keeping troops in harm's way for the sheer sake of surviving the ballot box.
And Payne makes it clear this is not a partisan phenomenon, right? It is
Yeah.
a structural flaw in democratic war-making. He analyzes President George W. Bush in 2006.
Okay, what happened there?
Well, Iraq was visibly descending into sectarian civil war, and the administration knew the current strategy was failing. But with the highly contested midterm elections approaching, Bush deliberately delayed announcing the troop surge for over 6 months, fully understanding how politically unpopular sending more troops would be at the polls.
Wow.
That 6-month delay cost crucial operational time and, inevitably, lives.
Payne also points to President Obama in 2011.
Yeah.
The military actively proposed keeping a follow-on force in Iraq to support local forces and prevent a resurgence of regional terrorism.
Right.
But the administration, with the 2012 re-election campaign looming, watered down those military proposals to offset the political risks of breaking a major campaign promise to end the war.
Yes.
According to Payne's analysis, that politically motivated withdrawal created the exact security vacuum that allowed ISIS to eventually emerge. And, we have to state our goal here isn't to take political sides.
Absolutely not.
We're just relaying how the material demonstrates the profound, often tragic impact of the electoral calendar on military strategy.
It illustrates perfectly why democracies struggle so immensely with asymmetric warfare. The strategic timeline required for success in these complex conflicts often stretches across decades. That timeline is fundamentally incompatible with an election cycle that demands visible, easily digestible results every 2 to 4 years.
So the political timeline is actively hostile to the military timeline.
Entirely.
Having seen how big nations fail in these irregular wars, how they are blinded by strategic narcissism, caught in the logistical gravity of mission creep, paralyzed by sunk costs, and ultimately sabotaged by their own domestic politics, how on earth can they prepare for what's coming?
It's a huge challenge.
Because the consensus across all these texts is that we are entering a high-stakes era of great power competition.
Right. To survive competition with massive, well-resourced rivals like Russia and China, both McMaster's testimony and the NCOR's brief argue that democracies must urgently abandon strategic narcissism. They need to adopt what McMaster calls strategic empathy.
I love that concept. It's like playing a high-stakes game of poker and finally bothering to look at the other player's face, their tells, their history, instead of just obsessively staring at your own hand.
Yes.
It means viewing the world through the rival's eyes, understanding their ideology and their unique aspirations, rather than just assuming they will automatically react to whatever we decide to do.
A perfect analogy. When you apply strategic empathy to the Chinese Communist Party, for instance, a very different picture emerges.
Right.
McMaster details that the CCP isn't merely reacting to United States policy. They have strong independent agency and are pursuing a long-term goal of national rejuvenation.
Which involved a lot.
A ton. The documents detail how they are executing this through systemic economic coercion, forced labor practices, and an unprecedented military buildup specifically, an over 800% increase in defense spending since the mid-1990s.
And their strategy goes far beyond just traditional military buildup, doesn't it?
Far beyond. Crucially, they are utilizing the open nature of free market economies to their advantage.
Oh, this part was fascinating.
Yeah, they use Western capital markets, often through complex indexing in Western retirement funds and institutional investments, to essentially trick democracies into funding the development of their own technological police state.
Just incredible.
It is a masterclass in integrating military ambition with global economic strategy.
Which brings us to Russia. Their economy is a fraction of the size of the U.S. or China. You would think that requires a totally different approach.
It does. Russia requires a distinctly different flavor of strategic empathy. McMaster points out that Vladimir Putin is deeply aware that Russia is far too weak to fight NATO in a direct conventional war.
Right, they can't win that.
No. So instead of building a massive conventional army to match the West, he relies on new generation warfare.
New generation warfare.
Yes. This strategy bypasses tanks entirely and relies on cyber attacks and massive, algorithmically driven disinformation campaigns designed to systematically destroy public trust in democratic institutions.
Wait, so if Putin knows he can't win a tank battle against NATO, his most efficient strategy isn't to build better tanks. It's to make sure the U.S. and its allies are too politically paralyzed to ever deploy theirs.
Exactly.
He's weaponizing the exact domestic political vulnerabilities we were just talking about.
That is the insidious brilliance of new generation warfare. If the ultimate saboteur of Western military strategy is domestic political division, Russia's strategy is to constantly pour gasoline on those divisions.
Wow.
They use bot farms and cyber-enabled information warfare to algorithmically amplify fringe voices, incite fear on both the far right and the far left, and polarize open societies.
Keeping everyone fighting each other.
Precisely. They make it nearly impossible for democracies to maintain the unified, long-term political will needed to counter Russian aggression.
But if we push back hard against these superpowers, if we aggressively counter China's economic strategies and Russia's information warfare, don't we risk stumbling into the Thucydides trap?
Oh.
That historical theory, that when a rising power aggressively challenges a status quo power, catastrophic war becomes almost inevitable.
It is a pervasive fear among policymakers. But McMaster synthesizes a very clear, counterintuitive response to that anxiety. He argues that engaging in transparent, firm competition and maintaining strong, forward-positioned military alliances are actually the only proven ways to avoid the trap.
Really?
Yeah. His thesis is that passive accommodation doesn't appease rivals. It merely signals weakness and invites further aggression.
Oh, I see.
By competing firmly and demonstrating unmistakably that adversaries cannot accomplish their objectives through force, you actually create the boundaries necessary for cooperation on more stable, peaceful terms.
This has been a heavy, deeply illuminating journey through these texts. We started with Sun Tzu's elegant, mathematically perfect rules for strategy.
We did.
We saw how in the muddy real world, those rules get derailed by strategic narcissism, the sheer arrogance of underestimating asymmetric foes who are fighting for their survival. We explored the logistical quicksand of mission creep and the agonizing emotional toll of sunk costs. And we laid out how the relentless pressures of domestic election cycles force leaders to make disastrous, politically motivated military decisions.
And the relevance of this material to you, the listener, cannot be overstated.
Definitely.
The alignment of national policy and military strategy isn't just obscure trivia for Pentagon planners. It dictates global stability, the strength of the global economy, and the fundamental safety of the open societies you live and work in.
Yeah.
When massive nations fail to align their policy blueprints with their strategic realities, the ripples are felt by everyone, everywhere.
It brings us right back to that messy, unpredictable chessboard. But I want to leave you with a final unmentioned synthesis to ponder based on everything we've read and discussed today.
Okay.
Sun Tzu wrote that the absolute highest form of generalship is breaking the enemy's resistance without ever fighting. Well, we've seen extensively from these sources that large open democracies are fundamentally constrained by impatient voters, hyper-focused election cycles, and deep domestic political divisions.
Yes, they are.
So here is the question. Does this mean that authoritarian regimes, who do not have to worry about midterm elections, who don't face public backlash over sunk costs and casualties, and who can casually plan their strategies in decades rather than 4-year cycles, are actually structurally better equipped to achieve Sun Tzu's highest ideal?
That is a genuinely chilling thought to end on. If the greatest weakness in war is a divided home front, regimes that enforce unity by decree might just hold a terrifying long-term structural advantage over open societies.
Something heavy to mull over the next time you hear a political promise about a quick, easy military intervention. Thank you for joining us on this custom deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning the blueprint.